Falcha, welcome back. Here we are at part 2 of our book, Jesus and the Essenes by Dolores Cannon. And we're starting chapter 5 of the book, the descriptions of Qumran, the community in the hills that was kept secret where this sect of Essenes lived. According to the young woman who described this under past life regression, this was not a religious group of men in a strict community at all. It wasn't anything at all the way historians had assumed it was. It was a community walled in. It had libraries, houses, a temple, things made of clay brick. And it was in the hills overlooking the sea. The buildings had flat roofs and shared walls. So kind of reminded me of a description of maybe the Verde, what's it called? I want to say Palos Verde. I know that's wrong. You know what I mean, though. The Native American cliff dwellers, well, the houses attached. There were a couple of large courtyards with fountains and gardens. It was more lush than you would picture. They had a study in the library, a center for people to study. They had fruit trees with paths and flowers. The majority of the people did not live within the walls. Mostly the single students and masters lived within the walls. The other people lived in their own homes outside the walls, up in the hills. And archaeologists at this point had thought it was all male and all inside the confines. So they took this information later and they went up into the hills and did some more exploratory digging and discovered there were indeed homes, and they found the bones of women and children. So that's a substantial archaeological physical evidence that backs up this regression, because it was discovered after the regression. Mostly it was just the priests who stayed inside the walls, the masters. The families ate in their own homes. They did not eat communally, as historians had believed. The dining hall was mostly used for large festivities and large gatherings. There was one entry by the main gate, but all the other entries were kept secret. They were really worried about their own security. The library was 2 stories tall. It had a dining area, which was an assembly area, that had a 2-story ceiling. There was nothing actually above that. And the gate was lower down below, and there were 3 floors in some of the towers attached to the gate. The apartments for the unmarried young adults were included inside the walls, and Sudi, this regressed person, disagreed with the archaeologists and said that there was no teaching and there were no ceremonies that went on during meals. A lot of assumptions were made by archaeologists and historians that were dispelled by the words of this regression, and then physical evidence found to actually support Dolores's information. There were no strict religious rituals. Nothing was mandatory. They did have a Sabbath ritual. Other than that, nothing was mandatory. They had kind of like a large pantry, or a what do they call it in prison when you go and you buy your consignments, your food. They all shopped at the same area. There was no money exchanging hands, but there was the central area where food supplies were kept, and it was supervised by somebody called the keeper of the stores. And interestingly enough, gluttony was not allowed, so I guess you could kind of call this the Essene diet. They ate millet. They didn't eat it like a porridge or anything like that. They rolled it into sort of a dough and a bread with herbs. They ate meat. They ate lamb, goat, ox, and birds, but it was a personal choice. They had a rule, very much like the Jews, that they didn't eat animals that had cloven hooves or had cud. If they did both those things, they didn't eat them. The belief was that it was not really good to kill something for your own enjoyment. It ties your soul to the earth, but they didn't impose vegetarianism. They were kind of in that ambivalent situation that I'm in still, still trying to figure out what the right thing to do is. They drank wine, water, and milk. They drank mint tea, but they didn't have any coffee, so I couldn't be a member. They ate fruit, but not very many vegetables. They had bed frames that were supported with ropes crisscrossed and then padding on top of that. They had fully designed chairs, tables, cushions, much more of a modern situation than you might imagine for the time. They had very comfortable surroundings. They believed it was ideal to not use a pillow under your head when you went to bed, that your feet should be higher than your head. They had only those for furnishings. For storage, they just had open shelves. They didn't have cabinets or, wooden containers for things. They didn't do decorations, interestingly enough. Statues were not allowed because they felt they were graven images. And it was too much like the false gods of the Romans and of other pagan religions who worshipped animals and that kind of thing, and they did not want that association. And when they were trying to describe to her what decorations meant, Sudi's response was, well, why would you want to do that when you could just look at nature? They had abstract paintings on papyrus, and they would hang those on the walls, but they were abstract. They weren't of a specific thing. They said it was what the soul sees. Very interesting. They meditated and then painted these things and hung them up. They had no need for a temple because they believed that your temple starts from within you, and that Roman temples were defiled by animal sacrifice and false beliefs, so they wanted no part of those. They had Jewish people who worshipped in a temple and separated the men and the women. And then Jewish people had a synagogue, which was a school, and women and Gentiles were allowed to enter there. But these guys didn't have that. They had a gathering area. It was called a temple, but everybody sat on the floor. This reminds me very much like a lot of things I went to in the late 60s, early 70s. I can picture this. Everyone sat cross-legged on the floor, and behind this altar setup, there was an inner sanctum with the Torah and the scrolls, but mostly what they did there is large group discussions, and they did have one ceremony that they did almost every day, and I thought it was very interesting. So did Dolores. It was called the passing of the cup, and they would pass around a cup of wine, which symbolized that everyone shared the same blood, that everybody was one, and it was just the sharing. Sound familiar? Therefore, the Last Supper was not some new ritual that Jesus invented. It was a continuation of Essene rituals. And sharing bread, splitting bread between people was a Jewish custom. Sharing wine was an Essene custom. This has been conflated inflated into something that it really wasn't meant to be, according to these regressions. And they burned sandalwood when they did these sorts of things because it was supposed to be conducive to creating the right atmosphere. When asked, Sudi had no familiarity with the idea of baptism. They did not feel a need for that. They had a rite with washing to symbolize the decision to follow the way. This is what their belief system was called, the way. And they had a fountain in the courtyard, and they would just wash themselves. And they wore either a flaxen robe or and it was done with a priest, but it wasn't a dunking and a rebirth, and it had none of those associations. John the Baptist was an Essene, and he followed this ritual, and it shows very much his connection to the Essenes, but the modern day Christian interpretation of it is erroneous compared to the original source intent. They dressed very simply. They wore plain robes of wool or linen. And men wore a breechcloth. They all wore sandals. The men, usually their clothing was sort of off-white, natural fiber. The men wore a beard, which symbolized belonging, and mostly it was because the Romans were clean shaven. And you know what the Romans did? They shaved all the hair off their entire bodies, and they oiled themselves and scraped the oil off, and that's how they would get clean. Ew. On the outside, when they left the community and went mingled amongst the rest of the world, they were required to dress like the other people and not like themselves, because they wanted to blend in, because they were at risk. And people on the outside wore colorful clothes and headdresses, and it really was a difference in how they dressed. But they were in danger in the public if they were known. Inside their walls, they distinguished each other, and it wasn't for a hierarchy, it was for safety. They were concerned about bad guys, spies in the camp. And so they wore a cloth band around their forehead, tied in the back, and the color represented who they were, their association. And this is for both men and women. So if they wore gray, it meant they were a young student. Green meant a more fully developed student who was a seeker. Blue was a master. White was an elder. And if you wore red, it was because you were a visitor, a sympathetic visitor from the outside. And all of this symbolism was not allowed to be told. So if you showed up wearing the wrong color or not wearing one, they would know immediately you were a stranger. And interestingly, while Dolores was doing one of these sessions, Katie, this young woman, suddenly slapped herself in the face. And Dolores said, "Wow, what are you doing?" And it was a bug. There was a bug, but there was no bug. It was back in the time. She asked, did they have pets? And Sudi had no idea what she was talking about. Pets, what are you talking about? And she explained, what a pet was. And Sudi's reaction was, that's so selfish. What about the animals' needs and wants? And how can animals be your friend? And why would you keep a cat? Cats and dogs, they eat dead things and they carry vermin, and just completely culturally foreign. They did have adders, which are poisonous snakes, and they would kill them. They knew that they were dangerous, and venomous snakes, and they killed them. They bathed daily. They had a large room with a big pool, and that was used for bathing, and benches all along the side. And interestingly enough, here's where John and Yoko come in. Interestingly enough, men and women didn't separate. They bathed naked, and they all bathed communally in this pool. They used pumice instead of soap, and the water came up and replenished from a spring underground. But when asked about men and women naked in the pool, Sudi couldn't understand why this was an issue. She said something like, well, your bodies are made by God. What's there to be ashamed of? I don't understand the whole idea of shame associated with nakedness made no sense to her whatsoever. I thought that was really interesting. Especially that women were considered so equal. And this is the philosophical backbone of Jesus's beliefs. They had 2 drinking wells, 2 fountains, not a well, but 2 fountains that they used as drinking water. They were square storage containers that were as deep as a man's waist and covered, and they would keep those filled with water and dip with buckets. Indoor, they had latrine pit systems that were added to with some kind of natural chemical. They had a pool boy, natural chemical, to keep them clean. So they had indoor plumbing that water flushed through. Actually, I was in, was it Herculaneum? Pompeii or Herculaneum, I don't remember. It might have been both. The Romans had indoor plumbing. Not everybody used it. They had outdoor latrines too, but the nicer places had a whole system of indoor plumbing, and you could still see the pipes and the seats and everything. I was really surprised because my concept of how people lived back in those days, and this is kind of around the same time, I had a much more primitive, made a much more primitive assumption about the quality of their day-to-day lives. And of course, poor people had nothing, but it did exist. Modern engineers did discover a complex water system, 2 baths, cisterns, and small canals, all connected. They did not collect rainwater was rare. The water flowed from an underground spring that had existed at the time, and engineers found everything that would have been necessary to back up this story after the fact of the story. But the Romans ruined it. I mean, they found the remnants of it, archaeologists did, but the Romans ruined it. Archaeologists found little cubicles with toilets. I mean, they had thought that they were stables, and based on this description, checking for plumbing, they realized, oh, they're not stables at all. It was a bathroom with stalls. Most of the people in the commune rose with the sun, but others would sleep all day because they would stay up at night to watch the night sky. Nobody was kept to a schedule. There was no onus put on early to bed, early to rise. That's, that comes later. That's nonsense. People were on whatever schedule suited best their system of learning, their time, their own circadian rhythm. There were 2 kinds of lights. I found this absolutely fascinating. So there were 2 kinds of lights, oil lamps. And oil lamps were basically just little containers with oil and something to burn. The oil was the fuel, and then a wick. And they were smoky and not very bright. But they found the remains of what they believed to be essentially a battery-operated lamp. Sudi described a beautiful light that was brighter than most lights and didn't need fuel like oil. And then he described what this system was. And I was going to say the light bulb went on over Dolores' head. What Sudi described was what is now known as the Baghdad battery. Let's see if I can find this here. It was easier for me to read this than it was to just write it all out again. So this information on this device is in Charles Berlitz's book, Atlantis, the Eighth Continent. So Dr. Wilhelm Koenig, an Austrian archaeologist employed by the Iraq Museum, unearthed in 1936 a 2,000-year-old vase 6 inches high, which contained inside it a copper cylinder set in pitch, and inside that an iron rod secured with an asphalt plug. This object resembled others in the Berlin Museum, some larger, with a repetition of the cylinder settings. There is no clue to their function except that they were religious or cult objects. It occurred to some investigators, including Dr. Koenig, that these might be dry cell batteries, which understandably were no longer in working condition after several thousand years. However, when they were exactly reconstructed and provided with a new electrolyte, they worked. This ancient use of electricity may, of course, prove only that electric power was used for electroplating metals with gold and silver, as is still done in the bazaars of the Middle East. But it is also likely that it was used for the illumination of temples and palaces, although its use disappeared before the middle epoch of antiquity, that of the Greeks and Romans, who used oil for illumination. Except according to these past life regressions, during the time of the Romans in Israel, Jerusalem area, they used these jars with a translucent globe, and one was placed inside the other and twisted, and it lit indefinitely and very, very brightly, and Baghdad battery. That solves that little mystery. So, chapter 6, the government of Qumran's community. They had a council of 9 or 10 elders that set the rules and judged people. Nobody was in charge. There was no leader. It was too much power for one person. But this council helped to, like the Supreme Court, only I hate to say that, given the situation we're in today. Only masters and students had a say about what happened in the day-to-day running of the community. But this included women. They had an equal voice. If you committed violence, you were kicked out. The worst punishment that could happen to you is you would be kicked out of the community. The masters determined the punishment, and usually you sat and talked with them and evaluated what you had done, and it was about harming other people. And when you caused hurt or harm to somebody else, they determined whether you would have a punishment like having to fast or do penance. They would remove a privilege. Those are the only kind of punishments they had. It was okay to leave the community if you got tired of it, but it just didn't happen. People liked living there. The quality of life was quite high. They turned applicants away if they found, they did an intensive application process. And you were turned away if they found any evidence of malice, or they looked into your background, I don't know, the FBI background check. But if you didn't meet up to the standards of character, you weren't allowed. Sudi often refused to answer Dolores' questions if she asked anything about the defenses, like the physical defenses of the community, or weapons. And finally, she kind of extrapolated from the whole Joshua and the Battle of Jericho and blowing the horn and the wall fell down. She asked, did you use sound? And Sudi said, yeah, but would not discuss it any farther than that. They did not believe in animal sacrifice. They said that this was borrowed by the Jews from other religions. It had not traditionally been in the Jewish religion. They had holy days. They celebrated Passover and the Day of Atonement, which actually was like a week. They did a ritual called the washing of feet, where a host would wash the guests' feet, and it was simply a symbol of humility. She said it was a very joyful community. It wasn't full of rules. There weren't a lot of constraints on personal behavior. People were expected to behave, to contain themselves, to develop self-control and treat each other well. They bathed regularly, and they considered that important for your outside health, and they fasted regularly, and they considered that important for your internal health, and they believed in the laws of karma for the soul, the ancient laws of nature for the soul. Couples, this is so interesting. I have to talk to Denise about this a little bit. Couples were matched by their astrological charts. So when babies were born, their chart was done, intensive chart, and they were paired up based on how well their charts meshed. And you were allowed to stay single. Nobody was forced to get married. No woman had to be married. No man had to be married. There was no stigma on it one way or the other. And they believed that God created male and female to complement one another, not to be above or below. And I think I talk about this later, but just in case I don't, sexual activity was not forbidden. There was a sense of responsibility for each other. I think I do talk about it later. Their whole gender politics, really interesting considering the time and place. They had servant members to do cooking and cleaning, but it rotated. Everybody took time to do this, and it was considered a practice of humility. And if you were in trouble for something, it might be given to you specifically as a penance, but mostly people volunteered as an opportunity to challenge themselves to be humble. Students did it to learn humility and to overcome pride. They had no slaves. In fact, whenever they had money, which was rare because they did not really much engage in pecuniary affairs, they would buy slaves and free them. They shared everything. Certain personal items you could keep, like Sudi played the flute. The flute was his flute and nobody else used it. But other things were just communal. They didn't own a piece of furniture. They didn't own specific dishes. Everything was just shared. And the expectation was you would do your best, because doing your best makes you equal. That no job, no position was exalted more or less over the other. And to judge somebody else based on anything like that or at all was a sin. And most would ask for forgiveness. If they did something, they would ask against somebody, they would ask the victim for forgiveness, but they were also required to ask themselves for forgiveness. And their rule was, if you love others, then there are no problems, which I find remarkable because I think they did a lot of experiments in communal living in the 60s and the early 70s, and not a whole lot of them were successful in the very long term. But then people did not continue to abide by the law of, if you love others, then everything will be fine. People got selfish and possessive and jealousy and, the usual human frailties. I think it's interesting they were able to maintain these communities by remaining dedicated to those philosophical beliefs. This is interesting. They only allowed widows to remarry if they could find an individual whose chart matched, and it was always a choice. Nobody was forced, but they didn't agree with the Jewish law of a brother having to marry his brother's widow. They thought that was, women should have personal agency. Hint, hint, Texas. They said it was unusual for people to get divorced just because, it was based on astrology and they usually got along okay. However, if that didn't work out and they were unhappy in the relationship, the elders would allow it. It wasn't forbidden. They just needed to know, why? What is there something we can help you to work on? But you're not forced to remain in an unhappy relationship. And this is because even though they match them with astrology, souls can make mistakes because we're here to learn. And we need to learn different lessons at different times in our lives. And you can be married early to somebody and then learn what you need to learn and then need to move on. And there's no recriminations. In the early days, they believed that a man and a woman had many mates to produce mates for the children. I used to get in trouble, in school. You learn about the Garden of Eden. I always wanted to know who Cain and Abel married. And this attitude, this sort of laissez-faire attitude about everybody could have many spouses, and the idea was to populate because of sparse population and not to make the relationship a matter of ownership. But it all changed under Moses. And adultery, they had a very interesting take on adultery. You could not have sexual encounters with somebody else's spouse unless the other spouse approved. Interesting. So if you got the hots for somebody else's husband or wife, the three of you would discuss it. And if you got permission, it was allowed. The idea was you didn't want to hide the activity and be secretive about it, because it's a lie, and you didn't want to hurt the third person. But if it was openly agreed upon, then it was just considered sharing and everything was great. This is so John and Yoko. I mean, the whole situation is pretty hilarious when you think about it in terms of the 1960s. Too bad it didn't continue, They found that the Roman habit of convention of executions was just absolutely appalling and wrong. They buried their dead or they cremated them. It was a personal choice. They did not believe that your body would need to rise again after death the way that the Egyptians did. And the only reason why they anointed bodies in their tradition was because of the smell. It helped to settle things down for a while. When they excavated their cemetery, after they found their cemetery, they proved that all this stuff was true. Some people had cremains in ash jars, and some people were buried, bones and all, and they found remnants of oil on wrappings, and they were not buried with grave goods. The Romans had many gods, they believe. This is so great. You're not supposed to judge, but they did judge the Romans quite a bit. They believed the Romans had many gods because the Romans were unsure of themselves, and that the emperor really, the more power that you claimed and the more elevated you put yourself, actually the weaker and more defective of a soul you were. I love that take on it. So the emperor at this time was the guy in charge, and then there was the Roman governor, who happened to be Pontius Pilate, and who worked in consort with the Jewish king. So the Romans didn't want to dirty their hands dealing with the Jews. So they were in charge of everything, but they assigned the Jewish king to be in charge of the Jews and be their proxy, and that was King Herod Antipas. So, continue. Chapter 7 is this mysterious library. They had a huge library. Their goal was to collect all the knowledge in the world. It had high ceilings with many windows to provide light. They had shelves of scrolls everywhere, and so much knowledge as a person could ever learn, and you could study your whole lifetime and not learn it all. The windows were covered in skins that had been treated to be translucent to let light in, but to keep out bugs and dust. The scrolls were in every language in the world. They had the hidden knowledge in mathematics that would someday be rediscovered and reused. They hid all this knowledge when they knew, because they were precognitive and they meditated. They had prophecy. They knew that their community was going to be destroyed. So they went out of their way to hide, as we'll learn, to hide all of their knowledge. This is the occult knowledge. Occult is a Latin derivative. It comes from the Latin word that means hidden, not evil, not scary, not from the devil. Occult means hidden, and this knowledge was hidden to protect it, to save it from being lost to mankind. And it will be at some point rediscovered and reused. And we're wondering, of those 400 pieces of scroll, is that perhaps where some of that knowledge is that's being hidden from us again? But it will be revealed again. Very interesting, in this library they had devices for counting. They used knotted strings, so they had measured strings with knots in them, and these strings were of different lengths, and they had knots at measured places, and they used them to count, which sounds very much like a tool used by the Incas in Peru, the guipa, I think that's how you say it. And the length of the string and the type and the position of the knots is based on the decimal system. Then she described something that I went, oh my God, we use this with our children. See if you recognize the sound of this. They used sticks of different sizes and colors that had a relationship in size to each other for different amounts. If we homeschooled, this was a real popular little device for mathematics for grade school children called Cuisenaire rods. And what they were little wooden sticks. They were not a whole lot thicker than this pen, and the long ones were worth, 10 small cubes, and then the half size were 5 small cubes, and they were on the decimal system, and each length had a different color to designate its value, and you use them to sort of visually and physically, kinesthetically give kids a sense for the relationships between numbers, and a very effective way of teaching decimals and multiplication, that kind of thing. They also used a frame, this should sound familiar, a frame with beads for counting, an abacus. They had telescopes and star maps, and von Daniken talked about finding in Assyria from the 7th century BC glass lenses, and they didn't know what these glass lenses were for. Well, they had knowledge of telescopes. They had an orrery, O-R-R-E-R-Y, which is a gigantic model of the heavens, the relationship in space between planets, moons, and whatever it is you're trying to depict. And this was made of bronze. It was the size of 2 men with arms outstretched around it. The sun was in the center. The planets moved around it. And it had been put in an area with a low wall, a low fence where you couldn't accidentally get into it and bump into it. It was set in perpetual motion. They think it might have been operated by centrifugal force. They're really not sure how they got it to work. But they knew the sun was the center of the solar system, and they knew how the planets related to each other. But they had 10 planets. We didn't discover Pluto, number 9, until 1930. They called their number 10 planet Juno. We don't know. They said that it did an elliptical looping path, which takes an extremely long time to make one orbit. And so, I don't know. They could not see all of the stuff that they knew about without these telescopes, and they could not see some of it with their telescopes. So they knew more than what meets the eye without a telescope. But there were other things that even the telescope didn't have, which now has been proven to be true with modern, like the Hubble, that kind of thing. So this knowledge was handed down from somewhere, and they don't know where. They explained that it came from people that they called the Kaloo, K-A-L-O-O. And I just have to make a little personal statement. I don't understand why in all of these philosophies and religions, like Scientology and all these esoteric belief systems, the Sumerian gods, why is everything so difficult to say and so funny sounding? So Kaloo is the name of the people, and I shouldn't laugh because you'll find out. So who are the Kaloo? So this is the response of Sudi, the regressed person. How do I say this? They are the people who left their country to share the knowledge that they had gained with others. And it is said that we are from these people. It is said that we are members of their dying race. We are taught to spread knowledge among the uninformed in hopes to bring about the age of enlightenment again. I do not know much about them. Some of the masters know in great depth the things that they teach and who they were. It is knowledge that is only allowed to the eyes of certain ones, and it is not permitted to speak among strangers. Dolores says, I wondered if they might have had some connection with the lost continent of Atlantis and asked if he knew the name of the place they had come from. Sudi says, I do not know. It is said that this has been lost. They say that they came from the direction that the sun sets, from the west, that they settled in Egypt and then traveled this way. I do not know where they went. This was many, many fathers ago. Was there a time when things were more enlightened than now? She asks. He says, I do not know much of it. It said that it was when great things were done, when all men were as one. And we have just some of those things, such as this model, are things that are protected and kept to show that these things were possible, that they were not just legends. It's said that the Kaloo wander. That is part of their destiny. Some of them are said to have traveled in hopes of finding others of their people, and some are still traveling. And it is said that some of these have forgotten even from whence that they started. Others are like us here, descendants of some, and some others who were from here and are trying to protect some of the knowledge that was. So I thought that was just really, 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 really interesting. So I'm going to stop now because this is a good place to stop and upload this video. This is the end of part 2, and I'm really glossing over the tarot cards with this book because I think we're going to have a lot of questions, and I want to devote attention to the tarot without feeling pressed for time by the video running out. So let's address the book and get through it, and then we'll ask some questions. And if you guys have more questions as you watch the video, throw them into the comments and do them in capitals to catch my eye, and I will look and I'll try to see. Now, I don't know if you will have done this for part 1 because I forgot to mention it, but in subsequent videos, while it's uploading, I'll check the previous upload and see if you have questions for me to read for the tarot. It's my long-winded way of saying I'm going to quit now and upload this, and then we'll begin part 3. So this is the end of part 2. Sláinte.